Well, hello everyone. I'm back again to talk about Marianne Williamson 2024 possibility. Thanks, by the way, for everybody tuning in on my last video. Just kudos to you too. Thanks for the good comments. Thanks for over 300 viewers. It's unusual for my certainly my podcast, but I think it perhaps is an indicator of people sensing something in the air, right? This kind of zeitgeist of the times that someone like a Marianne Williamson really still we need to keep her voice fresh. Not that she needs to do that too. She knows how to do that, but I think also she may not always know all the reasons why. It's a diverse world out there, and I guess one of the things I'm doing in talking about Marianne Williamson and the possibility of 2024 and the future of the world really perhaps one of the most important by-elections coming up, according to Harvey Kaye. He's a historian who Marianne Williamson just talked to the other day on her Apple podcast. I highly recommend you go to see that. He's talking with her really about the history of America and reclaiming a certain kind of sense of what is America at its core, this zeitgeist, this sense of character even of American spirit, promise, democracy, the new world, all of those possible and really interesting symbols for really a new world. Some might even call a new age of possibility. Can we turn this around, right? You and I are probably just listening now. It's like some part of our brains going, are you kidding? America's such a mess. The world's such a mess. Yeah, well, here we are, Sunday night. I'm bringing forth a little bit of talk, exchange again, my book. I'm talking about that in the last video. So if you'd like to go there, you can kind of catch up, maybe even watch it before this one, but you don't need to. So I want to read a little bit, but the theme really of today is really Franklin D. Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt, his wife and partner in the 30s and 40s, particularly having a big effect on American politics and this zeitgeist, this felt sense of how to bring a collective of people together if you really want to have a democracy of the people for the people. And the other word is freedom. So we'll get to that in a moment and why the Roosevelts, particularly Franklin and Eleanor, are really an important love affair with Marianne Williamson in these days. So not only has she written about FDR's and Eleanor particularly as well, during her 1997 book, Healing the Soul of America, really recommend that to really get a sense of how she understands the history, in particular of America. But more than that, but where she saw and sees a vision that people like the Roosevelts, amongst some others, but she is particularly hung up on them in a good way. She says obsessed these days by the story, particularly of Franklin D. Roosevelt and how he was able to collect and bring not only the New Deal, which was very important coming out of the Depression, the rise of Nazism and World War II, etc., stirring. She also says he's not perfect, and she has many criticisms as well. So her and Harvey Kaye have this great talk on her Apple podcast. Go there if you want to hear the balanced conversation, the critiques, and the love that both of them have for what FDR represented, particularly in America at that time. So when I looked up my book tonight, kind of quite spontaneously, so it's not a really big planned podcast. I really want to see if I can stay in touch with this spirit in the work of Marianne Williamson coming to FDR. What is it that's going on? So I looked in my book in the index, looked at Marianne Williamson, FDR. Oh, there's 3 pages particularly that I give a lot of attention to their connection. Not as much as I kind of wish I did in retrospect. So this was a couple years ago when I wrote this. So let me just start reading around those 3 pages that are in the index, and then we'll pick up a conversation from that. I'll spin off and we'll see where it goes. Page 3, where I first make the encounter and connect the two of them again. Let's see where it goes. The last chapter 7 summarizes a few chosen lessons to be learned from her venture into formal politics. I believe a better understanding of the phenomenon and her personhood ought to help inform voters and non-voters, those in America and those globally, to participate with passion and conviction in the kind of world they really want. The political arena is for all people as citizens. Freedom is great and ideal, and it is a lot of hard work. Like Marianne Williamson, I want a world more peaceful and intelligent to solve the worst crises humanity is facing globally, of which the next decade will present to us as a species like a tsunami. The change is here. Note, in brackets, I wrote these sentences 2 weeks before COVID-19 shut down the world. This section, transformer for president, question mark, a shocking possibility. I quote Marianne Williamson. As a young girl and teen, I would ask during a presidential election, who'd you vote for, Daddy? All the way up to Sam Williamson's death in 1995. That was my insert. He would respond, F.D.R. Than Eleanor Roosevelt. It was kind of a joke. I was raised, she says, where F.D.R. had a very special place in my family's political lore. Thus, I'm old enough to remember when the Democratic Party had a soul. So I start now a little bit, I'll just read a bit and jump to the next quotes on FDR. Like the social media supporter in the opening quote from the 2019-20 Williamson campaign run for the leader of the Democratic Party in the US, my enthusiasm also peaks when I listen to her speaking truth to power. She talks of soul. She's one unique soul herself and a feisty boomer generation icon to those interested in transformation of ourselves and the world. Although there are many different definitions of transformation and transformers, most would agree that small changes to improve things in one's life or in the society are useful to a point. Eventually, under pressing new conditions, trials, and or under pathologies and errors in the system, a more risky, grander, and painful change is going to be required to adapt to demands for health, growth, and sustainable development. On the larger macro scale, this is the transformation beyond mere reform. It's necessary to serve the progress of the evolution of consciousness itself. Williamson is done with stumbling around, where too many politicians treat and tweak things to fix the problems in America. Rather, she asks, quote, shall we pave the way to humanity's higher purpose in line with our historical mission, or shall we continue to currently stumble into the depths of an irredeemable fall, end quote. The fall, not surprising, somewhat of a theological bit of language there. She will bring into her speeches and her rants, etc. I'm just going to skip to now the other couple quotes and some reading around them, and then we'll get into dive a little deeper at the end of this video into FDR, especially around fear. As you know, I'm a fearologist. That's my whole interest as a fearologist, educator, researcher in the Marianne Williamson phenomenon and where American politics and culture is evolving or devolving. Just a little section here under philosophy and theology, which is where I post and discuss several of places that I think Marianne Williamson ought to be seen far beyond, quote, a political type of person or leader. And I just quote her at the beginning under this section. The most consistent thing about my early 20s was a search for spiritual understanding. I had a voracious appetite for topics of comparative religion and philosophy. So as an author, I approached the Marianne Williamson phenomenon as, in my part, a tangled wood of branches of psychology, philosophy, and theology beneath the surfaces of presidential and or political happenings in general that she has participated in and continues to do so. As an educational philosopher, my interest is to set the stage for deeper understanding when and where learners come together and engage. Williamson is one useful symbol for us to concentrate upon in order to learn what is happening in our times. So I think the very next time I pick up on FDR is I'll start this paragraph, just jump in. In defense, I totally support Williamson's repeated FDRian message through the 2020 campaign run. Quote, from quoting Marianne here. The presidency is not merely an administrative office. That's the least of it. It is more than an engineering job, efficient or inefficient. It is preeminently a place of moral leadership. And I have things to say about American public policy. It's rotten to the core right now. Heartless, violent. It's an absolute emergency. This idea of the emergency comes out as I come to Eleanor, as I remember. Let me just see where I should pick up. I think I'll just pick up here. I think it leads to her connection to Eleanor Roosevelt. I am drawn to ask how aware she and the Marianne 2020 team were as to the challenges of managing Williamson's often extreme style of presentation and how reactions to it would shape her ongoing presentations. She wrote in her 2019-20 political philosophy campaign new textbook, Politics of Love, we are hanging on a cross of iron right now, and this is not just corrupt, it is dangerous for us all, end of quote. Cross of iron is quite the ecclesiastic metaphor. Williamson is extreme, attracted to the grand, symbolic, the dramatic. Quoting her, I have a dramatic personality, she said in 1992. She admits she has a generic, quote, hysterical personality, end quote, with the tendency to speak and write often in, quote, hyperbolic, end quote, generalization and exaggeration. Who will Williamson let advise her, I ask, in this regard to diplomacy, which a president more or less has to have some, a leader, a good leader of the many, of the people? And where will her graceful deportment, of the kind, say, of Eleanor Roosevelt, who was first lady and an activist and woman leader, of the kind that Williamson has always greatly admired? Yet they are so different. For example, a future direction and inquiry to consider for Williamson and her team, and those who, like her in the future, may elect her. What made the First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt so loved and so effective in the work she did across wide aspects of American society? Well, she had a calm power, but steady, confident wisdom. Rare these days. Currently, there is a sense of urgency and spectacle present when you see and listen to Williamson or read her political works. It is two-sided. One side, it is completely understandable. When one really faces into the fear and crises facing humanity and America's future. On this side, she goes with truth and passion for justice, speaking out for the oppressed as well as anyone in terms of content and analysis, all very real. The other side is of shadows. The problem is of unconscious or conscious distortion and loss of perspective, in what comes across as her, at times, near paranoidal framing, not fearlessness. The second side is basically a story construction guided by emergency, by attention grabbing, which easily can take on an inflated viral life of its own. Fear is the phenomenon I'm speaking of, and it's the daily bread of rescuers and first responders, to be they in politics or otherwise. They may well need emergencies, crises to feel fully useful. They may create them. Often they are caregiving, craving addicts. I know I was once part of their camp. A little admission there. They work in caffeine, adrenaline, loud, and fast hyper mode really well within a generic field construction of emergency time. Not that I want anyone to censor the E word either, that is emergency. There has to be something in between, too lax and too hyper panic. Where could Williamson reach for guidance in these times, I asked. What is reasonable and wise in this 21st century era of turmoil and collapse? I turned to What a Course in Miracles, Williamson's personally most influential text, to see what it says about leadership in difficult, if not chaotic and violent times. Quoting from the Course in Miracles. Give time to sitting quiet. There is urgency, but put your vitality into it so that you are not subject to the externals. Williamson has long promoted emergency. The sky is falling. Just what kind of audience is that going to attract? What kind of energy, I ask? What kind of intelligence? What type of leading is demonstrated? And is it integrative like the politics of love she promotes? Is it a genuine integrative leadership when it is based on the emergency discourse she draws repeatedly upon, just as do the other pundits, media, activists, fanatics, leaders, secular and religious, and elites at times? What does that alarm actually facilitate? A good deal of fear, and more likely, more than is useful. There's a few excerpts. I'm thinking when I think of the talk yesterday, where I want to dive now into F.D.R, why Marianne Williamson is, let's just say, in love. I'm not trying to be exaggerative or hyperbolic there. With F.D.R, you just got to listen to her in that talk with Harvey Kaye, the historian, on her Apple podcast, and you really get, and I get it from her writing. She often is going to F.D.R. She's often going to, in her speeches in 2019, 2020, with Cite F.D.R. Well, she's seeing in him and what he represented as really an elite class, the Roosevelts out of New York. Teddy, his uncle, was president before him and had his stint. And Franklin, particularly, probably because of his polio diagnosis and the effect it had on his life for the rest of his life, and the impact that had on Eleanor, his partner, as his main caregiver. It was really a combination that Marianne Williamson said it broke him open. And I think you can hear in her knowing this importance of transformation as a psychological principle and a reality, a phenomenon that some people go through. Could be a near-death experience. In a way, this is an image status experience of, a debilitating disease that changes your life forever. She just felt that all became for him, how is he going to deal with all his fear, terror around that? How is he going to then bring that sensibility, right? The fall through a transformation into a recovery, a renewal, and then speak to the people and connect with the people. And he came out of his elite box, and in fact, without going into all the politics of his campaign and his philosophy, he really went after the elite class, the economic system that is no longer supporting a democracy of the people. And this really is, to her heart, you can hear it hits her. That's the kind of person we need leading this country again. She says it bluntly. The historian Harvey Kaye with her agreeing, and they get into quite a ferment of this love affair with FDR. Well, let's bring in the fearologist point, because I just said that if you're coming from this construction of continually of an emergency narrative, not unlike the prophetic tradition does, and Marianne Williamson well knows the prophetic tradition, I would say she is a prophet for our time. That's not an exaggeration. She's trying to come at it both secularly and spiritually. And I wish her the best. That is a very interesting path she's walking. I love to see that in public stage, in public platform, in public education. How can we do that? How can we not make secular and spiritual opposite? She's really interested in that. So let's just call her an integral type of prophet, because she's trying to pull those opposites together. Well, then she comes, as I said, in the emergency, in that reading, that fear and too much fear is probably going to be likely what you exacerbate, whether she wants to or not, whether she uses the word love or not, politics of love. And no one more than any politician ever, my claim, has known the dynamics between love and fear like her. This is why I want to see her as leader of some kind, or at least she's on the main backstage advising to our new leader, a new leader. And when I say our, of course I'm American speaking here, but I'm a Canadian. But you see, that to me is irrelevant, my nationality. Okay, for political formal purposes, yes, it's relevant. But my wife and partner is American and votes in America as well as in here in Canadian, and we also were 9 years living in the heart of America, in Illinois. We got a pretty good sense of the politics and the culture of America and where it's going. Not pretty since the 2008 financial crisis onward, but it still wasn't pretty before that. The fear aspect or factor, what I like to call the fear vector, let's just connect it to freedom, because I'm going to get to FDR, who came up with the idea of 4 freedoms. Along with the help of Eleanor Roosevelt, she helped get that into the UN Declaration of Human Rights by 1948. So they both worked on this deep, let's call it, from the brokenness of their life and knowing this crisis that happened in their life through the polio diagnosis, and perhaps other things we don't know about, I don't know about. They came to a universal 4 freedoms, and he started giving speeches on this. And one's freedom of speech, freedom of religious choice, echoes of the Constitution, of course, of America. The third one was freedom from want. The last one, but not the least by any means, freedom from fear. Marianne Williamson and Harvey Kaye talk about how significant those last 2 are of the freedoms in terms of social justice as the core center foundation for all other freedoms and for what would be a free country, a democracy in the best of that liberal tradition. I'm not talking about a political liberal, I'm talking about a much larger philosophy in liberal politics of why freedom is so important for all people, not just the elites, those who have money, 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 etc. So power to the people is really freedom to the people. And are we going to educate through working with and helping them work with fear, right? Fear and freedom tend to go like this, opposite directions if you have excess. So that gets very interesting with Roosevelt's famous line, his dictum, his speech in 1933, his inaugural election. Roosevelt, this really powerful speech, in it, the famous line that gets repeated over and over and cited in my studies, I see it showing up all the time by all kinds of diverse people. And it's sort of taking the extract of from that speech was, the only fear we have is the fear of fear itself. That's part of his freedom from fear of the four freedoms, is putting it into another vocabulary for the people on a really large scale, with that coming out of the Depression. Like I say, coming up with the buildup of fascism in Europe and the threat to the world. F.D.R. is the president of all presidents who speaks of fear in such a forthright, potent way to say, people. He's probably saying many things with that line, that speech. But for purposes of just a short video, the fear of fear itself is the problem. We have nothing to fear except fear of fear itself. It's that doubling, fear of fear itself. So in my work in fearology and fearism, philosophy of fear, many of the things that I write and think about and read and hang out with some other folks around the world who are interested in fear as a central motivator, and a place to understand change and transformation. We really need this great fear education. I think Roosevelt was saying this on a world scale, but he said it in America in his inaugural speech. That's how you touch people. You touch them there in their core, in that, are they going to be controlled by fear of fear itself, with this negative association to fear, or is there another possibility? Now, I say that with a question mark. Is there another possibility? Well, of course, he was giving possibilities, but he didn't give a long lecture on the relationship between love and fear and freedom. No. And he didn't give a lecture of why he named fear itself, not just fears, not just the phobias, all the diagnoses, this fear, that fear, X, Y, Z. Fear itself. That, I think, is the profound moment of an idea, that fear, in fact, is an idea. That's Corey Robin, a great political philosopher of New York and scholar, politics of fear. He's named and nailed it, really, to say that fear's potency is not its emotional biopsychological aspect, especially in the individual. He says it's that fear is an idea. He nailed this in 2004 in his great book, Fear, Politics of an Idea. All of these are part of building, as you can see, a critical literacy around fear. And I think Roosevelt kicked it off in 1933, he kicked this off. We need a critical literacy on fear, but he did not set up the campaign, the educational programming, the populist education of how to get that critical literacy on fear. See, there's the falling to me. There's the miss. But why is Marianne Williamson so in love with Roosevelt? She's got all her reasons, and she'll give you those rationally. I'm giving you a hypothesis that I think she's in love because he's got the best quote on fear of all the politicians ever in America. And she's got the best quote on fear, I'm claiming. And I think many others would say this with her big speech. I don't have it in my hand right now, but it's on, what's our greatest fear? Our greatest fear is not that we're small and afraid. Our greatest fears is that we're great beyond imaginable. Paraphrasing. But that set of lines from Marianne Williamson from 1992, her book, The Return to Love, taken from the inspiration of A Course in Miracles. That line has been cited and still is cited over and over and over and over by just about everybody. I see it all the time as a researcher. So that's my hypothesis for Day. That one of the reasons that she loves F.D.R. is they got the best lines that have hit the cultural landscape on a massive scale and even into a world international scale. F.D.R. not as much as her, I think, but that's an arguable point. No one's done the research to actually compare who's getting cited more on those two sets of lines. Their speeches, right? They're the prophetic, and fear is central in that prophetic. What is our greatest fear? Now, of course, she inserts love, and no doubt, F.D.R. would insert love and talk about love and caring for the brotherhood and all these great things that makes an America and a democracy and freedom. But that's sort of where I was going tonight in this conversation with you. I think those are most of the things I wanted to bring up. Where do we go now? What's my challenge to Marianne Williamson right now? After listening to her talk with Harvey Kaye, I had this intuition. I heard a few things that she said. She really wants to recover this sensibility and that care and this broken openness and yet great strength of F.D.R. as a leader for their country, for democracy. And she's not like a dreamer, but she said he has vision. That's the vision. And other people have had vision. Maybe it was Thomas Paine before him, whatever. The founders of the American Constitution and so on. But she is looking for that flavor, that savoring of that America, that dream where we all could at least believe. We could disagree, she says, we can conflict, we can have battles, and they might be messy sometimes. But we don't have to fall back on they're right and they're absolutely all wrong. And I'm absolutely this and they're absolutely that. There's foundations. Do we want to live in America or we do not want America on what it is founded upon? So here's her traditionalist, you can hear her. And sometimes she's quite conservative in that way in her tradition. She's really Americanist, more than I particularly like, but I'm Canadian. But I think for a great world leader, she also has to transcend some of those things. Some of her biases, some of her F.D.R. loveness is great to a point. But Marianne, this is where I'm going in the end of the video is, and everyone else, do the work on reinterpreting and giving a really good talk and lecture on F.D.R.'s statement. The only fear we have to fear is fear itself. And then break that down and say, okay, let's take that wisdom that arose in 1933 and just end note here. That line, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. That actually has a trajectory. Some people have done research on it. I've done a little bit. And I know it traces back to Montaigne, a French philosopher, to all the way back to Bacon. Henry Thoreau used it back to Bacon in the 13th, 14th century, So it's like, it's been around. Fear of fear itself is more important than fears. once you reconstruct that, your your mind, your mental scape, your idea around fear and your relationship to fear, then we can work with that fear in a really good way. So it's not making fear good or bad. It's not what I do in my work. It's not what Marianne does, although the Course in Miracles sort of does almost. It's a bit extreme that way. When love is not present, then fear. It's hard to reclaim that, but she does also talk about with Harvey Kaye and others. I've heard her at times the spirit of fear as a theological purpose. Won't go into all those technical and philosophical and theological issues, but just to let you know, she is swirling in this wisdom. And not only that, this prophetic voice. And she's echoing FDR. She wants to be part of either herself or others, whoever goes and runs for the Democratic leadership. Get this back. Get this spirit back. Get this inquiry back. And obviously, as I said in my last video, Marianne, you have to talk about fear in this campaign. And that was one of my complaints, perhaps a hypothesis I was setting forth in my last video, Marianne Williamson 2024, is that I didn't hear the word fear coming up in many of her interviews and talks and so on. So it did come up a little bit in the talk with Harvey Kaye, but just very minor, and then they moved on. And I was going, oh, whoa, no, dissect that, deconstruct that, unpack that, bring forward more education around that idea. So as I end the video now, I think from the 4 freedoms, the last one, as I say, really foundational, I think, to the 4 freedoms. If we don't have freedom from fear, all those other freedoms on top of the are probably going to crumble. They won't be sustainable. That's my argument. Marianne might agree. But where we have to go is this better fear education, critical literacy, as I said. And I think one interesting phrasing that might be useful, so I'll throw this into the bucket for us as we go into the future. We're very tense next couple of years before the 2024 election. Into the bucket is freedom from fear is okay. It's an interesting place to take off from and could be part of a platform. But where it needs to go is freedom with fear. That's the shift. Freedom from fear, freedom with fear. That way we don't get caught into making freedom as a possible escape route again from fear. This is the new paradigm of the 21st century. I think Marianne Williamson is onto this, but has not quite articulated it in ways I would like. So what all that's worth, thanks for listening tonight. We'll see you next time.